The day Iran exploded, and the world paid attention. The Middle East has never been a quiet region, but in recent weeks Iran became the center of global shock and outrage. What began as protests quickly spiraled into something far darker. Streets that once echoed with chants for reform were suddenly filled with fear, gunfire, and silence. International observers, human rights groups, and leaked footage all pointed to the same conclusion. Iran's leadership had chosen force over restraint, and civilians were paying the price. Reports emerging from inside Iran described widespread crackdowns across major cities. Protesters demanding economic relief, political freedoms, and basic human rights were met with overwhelming force. Security units flooded neighborhoods, communications were restricted, and arrests happened on a massive scale. Families searched for missing relatives, while hospitals struggled under pressure. Although exact numbers remain disputed due to Iran's tight control over information, independent organizations warned that civilian deaths were rising rapidly. The Iranian government insisted it was restoring order and fighting what it called foreign-backed chaos. Officials claimed armed groups and outside intelligence agencies were fueling unrest. But videos smuggled out of the country told a different story. Unarmed civilians, including women and young people, appeared to be targeted during night raids and street confrontations. These images spread fast, igniting global anger and placing Iran under an intense international spotlight. As the death toll climbed, world leaders were forced to respond. Among them, one voice stood out immediately: Donald Trump. Never known for restraint or diplomatic softness, Trump reacted with sharp language and unmistakable warnings. He publicly condemned Iran's actions, calling the crackdown a crime against humanity and accusing Tehran of slaughtering its own people to cling to power. Within hours, tensions escalated from words to action. Trump's response was not framed as sympathy alone. It was framed as a warning. He made it clear that the United States would not tolerate mass violence against civilians, especially in a region already close to boiling over. Behind the scenes, military planners moved fast. U.S. naval assets were repositioned, surveillance intensified, and allies were briefed. The message to Iran was blunt. The world was watching, and consequences were on the table. For Iran's leadership, this moment was dangerously familiar. Decades of confrontation with Washington had taught them that Trump's threats were not always empty. During his previous presidency, Trump had shown a willingness to bypass traditional diplomacy and strike directly when lines were crossed. The memory of sudden sanctions, covert operations, and targeted military actions loomed large in Tehran. Inside Iran, fear deepened. Civilians were caught between a government determined to crush dissent and the possibility of foreign retaliation. Markets trembled, fuel prices surged, and rumors spread faster than facts. Would this turn into another regional war, or was this a pressure campaign designed to force Iran to back down without firing a single missile? Trump's public statements only added fuel to the uncertainty. He spoke of immediate consequences, unmatched power, and zero tolerance for mass civilian abuse. Supporters praised his tough stance, arguing that strong action was the only language authoritarian regimes understood. Critics warned that aggressive rhetoric risked escalating the crisis beyond control, potentially endangering millions. Meanwhile, Iran doubled down. State media dismissed foreign reports as propaganda and accused Western governments of hypocrisy. Iranian officials claimed casualties were exaggerated and blamed deaths on rioters and terrorist elements. At the same time, arrests continued, trials were rushed, and security forces remained deployed across cities. The gap between Iran's official narrative and the images circulating online grew impossible to ignore. International organizations attempted to intervene diplomatically. Emergency meetings were held. Calls for independent investigations echoed through the United Nations. But Iran's history of defiance made cooperation unlikely. The phrase "instant and brutal" began circulating across media platforms. It captured the fear that Trump might respond not with slow sanctions or quiet diplomacy, but with rapid visible action meant to shock Tehran into retreat. Whether this meant cyber operations, economic warfare, or military pressure remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that the old balance had been shattered. As the crisis unfolded, ordinary Iranians found themselves trapped in the middle of a geopolitical showdown. Their demands were simple: safety, dignity, and a voice. Yet their suffering was now entangled with global power politics. Every move by Tehran risked provoking Washington. Every statement from Trump risked pushing Iran further into isolation or defiance. Behind closed doors, how Trump turned pressure into power. While the world focused on Iran's streets and Trump's public warnings, the real action was unfolding behind closed doors. Power is rarely exercised in front of cameras alone. In Washington, emergency meetings stretched late into the night as military leaders, intelligence officials, and senior advisors analyzed every possible outcome. This was no longer just a human rights crisis. It was a strategic test of dominance, credibility, and timing. Trump's approach was deliberate but aggressive. Rather than announcing a single dramatic move, he unleashed pressure on multiple fronts at once. Financial networks linked to Iran were quietly targeted. Intelligence agencies increased monitoring of Iranian military activity, especially around shipping lanes and regional proxy groups. Allies were briefed not only on what Iran had done, but on what the United States was prepared to do next. The goal was psychological as much as political. Trump understood that Iran's leadership feared unpredictability. Unlike traditional administrations that relied heavily on gradual escalation, by keeping Tehran guessing, unsure whether the next step would be sanctions, cyber disruption, or military action, he forced Iranian planners into a defensive posture. At the same time, Trump leaned heavily on public narrative. He framed the crisis as a moral line in the sand, repeatedly emphasizing civilian suffering. This wasn't accidental. By positioning the United States as the defender of ordinary Iranians, rather than an enemy of the Iranian people, he aimed to weaken Tehran's claim that protests were purely foreign-driven conspiracies. The message was clear. Iran's government was isolated, even from its own population. Iran's leadership responded with defiance, but cracks began to show. Reports suggested internal disagreements between hardline commanders and officials, worried about international isolation. The economy, already fragile, reacted instantly to the mounting pressure. Currency instability worsened, foreign investment froze, and regional partners grew cautious. Even allies who typically supported Tehran urged restraint behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Trump's signals to the military were unmistakable. U.S. forces in the region shifted into higher readiness. Naval patrols increased. Surveillance flights intensified. None of these moves were outright attacks, but each one sent a message that escalation could happen fast. Iran's leadership had to assume that any miscalculation might trigger a response they could not control. Media outlets debated whether this was brinkmanship or strategy. Critics argued Trump was gambling with regional stability, risking a broader conflict that could spiral out of control. Supporters countered that Iran had relied for too long on the belief that the West would always hesitate. In their view, decisive pressure was the only way to stop cycles of repression and provocation. Inside Iran, the situation grew more volatile. Fear of external retaliation did not immediately reduce the crackdown, but it changed its tone. Security operations became quieter, less visible, as authorities attempted to avoid generating footage that could further inflame international opinion. Yet arrests continued, and families remained in the dark about detained relatives. The silence itself became a weapon. Trump, sensing momentum, escalated rhetorically once more. He warned that those responsible for ordering violence against civilians would be personally held accountable. This language signaled something beyond state-to-state punishment. It hinted at targeted consequences for individuals within Iran's power structure. For leaders accustomed to collective blame shields, this was deeply unsettling. Diplomacy was not abandoned, but it was redefined. Rather than offering immediate negotiations, Trump demanded visible changes first. He insisted that Iran prove restraint before talks could even be considered. This flipped the usual script. Instead of incentives up front, pressure came first, relief later. For Tehran, this left little room to maneuver without appearing weak internally. As days passed, the global reaction intensified. Protests erupted outside Iranian embassies. Human rights organizations released detailed reports. Social media campaigns amplified victims' stories. The narrative was slipping away from Tehran, and Trump ensured it stayed that way by repeating a simple theme. This was about civilians, not politics. Still, the risk of miscalculation loomed large. Every military movement carried the danger of being misread. Every statement could be interpreted as a threat. Analysts warned that history was filled with conflicts sparked not by intention but by misunderstanding. Yet Trump appeared willing to accept that risk, convinced that hesitation would only embolden Tehran further. By the end of this phase, Iran faced an uncomfortable reality. Its internal actions had triggered external pressure unlike anything it had seen in years. The United States had not fired a shot, yet the weight of American power was already being felt, economically, diplomatically, and psychologically. The question now was no longer whether Trump would respond. He already had. The real question was how Iran would react next, and whether restraint or retaliation would define the next chapter of this escalating confrontation, the edge of war. When pressure became a countdown. By the time the crisis reached its third phase, the atmosphere around Iran and the United States had shifted from outrage to anticipation. This was no longer just a confrontation of words, sanctions, or positioning. It felt like a countdown. Every hour without resolution made the possibility of escalation more real, and every signal from either side was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Iran's leadership found itself trapped between two dangerous options. On one hand, backing down publicly risked internal backlash from hardliners who viewed compromise as surrender. On the other hand, escalation risked provoking a response from an American president who had already demonstrated a willingness to act swiftly and decisively. The space for maneuver was shrinking fast. Inside Tehran, emergency councils were reportedly convened, Military commanders, intelligence chiefs, and political leaders debated next steps. Some argued for symbolic retaliation, limited actions designed to show strength without crossing a red line. Others warned that even symbolic moves could spiral out of control. The memory of past confrontations, where small incidents triggered massive consequences, haunted every discussion. Meanwhile, Trump's posture remained deliberately ambiguous. He neither confirmed nor denied specific plans. Instead, he allowed uncertainty to do the work. Statements from the White House emphasized readiness, resolve, and responsibility, a carefully crafted mix meant to intimidate without committing publicly to a single path. The silence between statements became just as powerful as the words themselves. Regional players reacted nervously. Countries across the Middle East increased security around critical infrastructure. Energy markets fluctuated wildly, reflecting fears that any disruption could send shockwaves through the global economy. Allies quietly prepared contingency plans, hoping they would never need to be used. No one wanted to be caught unprepared if the situation tipped into open conflict. Within Iran, the civilian population remained the silent center of the storm. Daily life grew more uncertain. Schools closed intermittently. Internet access was unstable. Rumors of foreign attacks mixed with fear of domestic repression. Many Iranians felt abandoned by their government and helpless in the face of forces far beyond their control. Their suffering, though less visible now, continued to define the moral core of the crisis. Trump's advisors reportedly debated timing above all else. Acting too early could unify Iran's factions against a common enemy. Waiting too long could allow Tehran to regain control of the narrative and present itself as the victim of intimidation. The window for maximum leverage was narrow, and Trump was determined not to miss it. At the same time, covert pressure intensified. Cyber activity increased across the region. Financial pathways tightened further. Diplomatic channels carried firm messages to Iran's remaining partners, warning against assistance or interference. None of this was officially acknowledged, but its effects were unmistakable. Iran's leadership felt boxed in from every direction. Media coverage added another layer of pressure. Analysts speculated endlessly about possible scenarios: targeted strikes, cyber retaliation, economic collapse, or sudden negotiations. Each theory fueled anxiety and hardened positions. For Trump, however, the attention served a purpose. It amplified the sense that action was imminent, whether it actually was or not. Iran attempted to regain initiative by signaling restraint while maintaining defiance. Officials spoke of sovereignty and resistance, but avoided overt provocations. This balancing act revealed how seriously Trump's posture was being taken. Tehran understood that even a minor incident could be interpreted as justification for retaliation. Behind the scenes, limited diplomatic feelers were reportedly extended through intermediaries. These were cautious, indirect, and fragile. Neither side wanted to appear weak by initiating talks openly. Yet the very existence of back-channel communication suggested that both understood the stakes. Total confrontation would be disastrous, but compromise carried its own risks. Trump, for his part, continued to frame the situation around accountability. He emphasized that his pressure was aimed at those in power, not ordinary Iranians. This distinction was strategic. It sought to undermine Tehran's claim that the United States was an external aggressor, while reinforcing the idea that Iran's leadership alone was responsible for the crisis. As days passed, tension peaked. Military readiness remained high. Markets remained volatile. Civilians remained anxious. Every silence from Washington and Tehran felt heavy with possibility. The world watched, waiting to see whether the standoff would end in sudden action, gradual de-escalation, or an explosive misstep. By the close of this phase, one truth was undeniable. The crisis had reached a point where inaction itself was a choice. Trump had applied maximum pressure without firing a shot, and Iran had absorbed it without openly retaliating. Something had to give. The only question was what and how violently. The aftermath. When power, fear, and history collided. The final phase of the crisis did not arrive with a single explosion or dramatic announcement. Instead, it unfolded through subtle shifts, quiet signals, and decisions made in rooms far from public view. After weeks of tension, the world began to sense that the confrontation between Iran and the United States had reached its limit. Something had changed. The countdown that once felt inevitable slowed, not because the danger had passed, but because both sides understood how close they had come to a point of no return. Iran's leadership faced a stark reality. The internal crackdown had achieved control on the streets, but at an enormous cost. International isolation deepened. Economic pressure intensified. More importantly, the legitimacy of the state had been shaken not only abroad, but at home. Fear could suppress protest, but it could not erase resentment. The longer the crisis dragged on, the clearer it became that brute force alone could not restore stability. Behind closed doors, Tehran recalculated. Hardline voices still pushed for defiance, but pragmatic concerns gained ground. The risk of provoking direct U.S. action, whether military, cyber, or economic, loomed too large to ignore. Trump's strategy of uncertainty had worked. By never revealing his next move, he forced Iran to assume the worst at every step. In Washington, Trump framed the moment as proof of strength. He argued that pressure, when applied decisively, could deter violence without immediate war. Supporters hailed the outcome as evidence that forceful leadership prevented escalation rather than caused it. Critics remained unconvinced, warning that the underlying issues had not been resolved, only postponed. Gradually, signs of de-escalation appeared. Iranian security operations became less visible. Public executions and mass trials slowed, though not entirely stopped. Communication restrictions eased slightly. These moves were subtle enough to avoid looking like surrender, yet clear enough to signal restraint. For Trump, this was enough to claim momentum. The U.S. response shifted accordingly. Military readiness remained high, but rhetoric softened. The language of immediate consequences gave way to cautious monitoring. Sanctions remained in place, but no new dramatic measures were announced. The message was implicit. Escalation was no longer the preferred path, but it remained an option if violence resumed. For ordinary Iranians, the aftermath was bittersweet. The streets grew quieter, but scars remained. Families mourned losses that would never make headlines. Trust in institutions eroded further. Many felt that their suffering had become a bargaining chip in a struggle between governments, rather than the central concern it should have been. Stability had returned, but justice had not. Internationally, the crisis left lasting ripples. Allies studied Trump's approach closely. Some saw it as a template for dealing with authoritarian regimes. Apply overwhelming pressure fast, dominate the narrative, and force restraint without prolonged conflict. Others viewed it as dangerously dependent on personality, warning that unpredictability could easily tip into disaster under different circumstances. Iran's regional influence also felt the impact. Proxy groups adopted a lower profile, at least temporarily. Financial networks tightened. Diplomatic relationships became more cautious. Tehran had survived the confrontation, but it emerged weakened, more isolated, and acutely aware of how vulnerable it could become under sustained pressure. Trump, meanwhile, used the episode to reinforce his broader worldview. He argued that strength prevented war, while hesitation invited chaos. In speeches and statements, he returned repeatedly to the idea that rapid, decisive pressure had saved lives by stopping violence before it spiraled further. Whether this claim would stand the test of history remained uncertain. What was undeniable, however, was that the crisis had redefined the rules of engagement. They were the outcome of deliberate choices made by those in power. External pressure may have slowed the violence, but it did not erase responsibility. Accountability remained an open question. For Iran, the future remained uncertain. Economic strain, public anger, and political fractures persisted beneath the surface. The pause in violence did not guarantee lasting peace. It merely bought time that could be used for reform or wasted in preparation for the next crackdown. For the United States, the confrontation reinforced both its power and its limits. Influence could be exerted without invasion, but not without risk. The balance between deterrence and escalation remained fragile. One misstep, one misread signal, could have changed everything. And for the world, the crisis served as a reminder of how quickly human lives can become entangled in geopolitics. The story of Iran as crackdown in America, Guy's response, is not just about nations and leaders. It is about the cost of authority without accountability, and the fragile line between order and oppression. It is a warning that power, once unleashed, is difficult to control, and that silence in the face of violence always carries consequences. The crisis may have faded from the front pages, but its lessons remain. The world now knows how close it came to something far worse, and whether those lessons are remembered or ignored will shape what happens next. This was not the end of the story, but it was the end of this chapter. If you want more deep, real-world breakdowns of global conflicts, hidden power moves, and the stories behind the headlines, like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss the truth behind world events.